it will not have escaped your notice, the biggest gathering of families and parents in nearly 50 years. There's not more directors of social services, there's not more commissioners, there's not more CQC practitioners. I just want to say thank you to Dr. Joyce, really. I think it showed a lot of integrity and character that she's come here and she's prepared to engage. That having been said, what I'm hoping to talk to you about is firstly our primary goal as a campaign, which is to stop the closure and lack of availability of new registrations for village communities on an arbitrary basis. That's one thing we would do. But it's much more than just special pleading from individual families who have loved ones who are dependent upon that care. It's also based on the principle, our campaign is based on the principle that the system should be what we call choice-based, and what that might look like and what that might mean. Obviously, there's a lot of work to do in relation to developing that model, but we think it would have certain features and certain benefits. And Luke has rightly said, well, choice, it's a kind of word that you can use and it can cover a multitude of sins, can mean this, can mean that. So it's very important. We understand that developing that in a way which is good and useful and meaningful would require, more than a little bit of work to put that vision into practice. The other thing that's come up is some of the downsides, purportedly, of village communities, of congruent settings. And what the campaign is absolutely not about is that any one type of care, be it village or anything else, is good or bad in itself. I mean, obviously, good villages should be supported. Poor villages should not, should be encouraged to improve as quickly as possible, or absolutely, if they're abusive or very poor, allowed to close. So the discussion really should be around, is there an individual type of care which in itself evidentially is very bad in terms of outcomes for recipients of that care? If not, then it should be about whether the care for that particular form of provision is good, bad, can be improved. A little about myself. As Baroness Cass has said, I've worked for over 30 years in the sector in a number of different roles. I won't admit to more than that, but I will tell you that it's at the upper end of 30 years plus. In that time, I've worked for good, bad, and indifferent leaders. In my time, I've had some good, bad, and indifferent days, as is the way with all careers. And what I would also say to you is that in that time, I've always viewed it, although I can't, oddly enough, I fell into the sector over 30 years ago, but I've always regarded it as a vocation rather than a profession or a trade. And in doing that, for me personally, working with and for service users, for families and for communities at times, that's been an absolute privilege. I've very rarely felt like I've worked a day in my life. I've been able to go to work, thoroughly enjoy what I do, sometimes get a bit tired, sometimes get a bit frustrated. But in terms of viewing how people work in this sector, there's a lot of talk of values-based and all the rest of it. There's a huge plethora of jargon. But I think that service-based model, some might say it's paternalistic. Personally, I don't think it is. But that service-based model is a key to how the sector should be encouraged to develop. I would say to you, finance has come up a couple of times, and I think it's naive to think there aren't financial considerations. Quite rightly, there's financial considerations. Many of you here will be taxpayers. I'm a taxpayer. It's absolutely right that the state takes a view on finance. Of course, You know, I think it's deeply unrealistic. You know, I've worked in local authorities. I've managed budgets. I've taken money out of budgets. I've taken money out of care packages. That in itself, the idea that that shouldn't happen is, well, I mean, it's a little bit ridiculous. But nonetheless, if it's based on a service model, if it's based on outcomes, if it's based on what's the right thing to do, if it's based on choice that's exercised by service users and families, then I think that's probably the best way to go. And I think, challenging though it may be, if the sector was developed in that way, it would frankly become more affordable, it would become more sustainable, and just as importantly, it would become much more humane. So what I would say about a choice-based model is that it would definitely save people's homes with what's happening at the moment. It would stop forced evictions, and there's all sorts of jargon and lovely cosy words that describe this, but the reality is forced evictions are taking place. People are being forced to leave their homes that they have lived in for 30 and 40 years, and they have and are quite happy and live sensible, fulfilling lives. I think the other thing that it would lead to, and I think this may indicate why there's such inertia and such resistance, is that a choice-based model would lead to a civilised and proportionate monitoring, governance and regulation. That is really important. It's really important that the governance of the sector is proportionate and does the job that we want it to do to deliver the outcomes. So if you imagine a world where you cannot choose where you want to live, which is what we're talking about, who you want to live with and how you want to live. If we weren't talking about people with a learning disability, and if it's not clear, we've looked at regulation, we've looked at law, this is what it looks like. Alfred, where do you live?
I live in Wembley.
How long have you lived there?
42 years.
Well, I've had a meeting. We've decided that you're not going to live in Wembley anymore. We're going to be good about it. We're going to have a consultation. It's going to be open for 3 months. You'll be able to say whatever you like. All your rights will be protected, but you will be moving. How does that feel, Alfred?
Horrendous. Disastrous.
Okay, don't worry. It's the right thing to do. Do you live with anyone?
Yes.
Who do you live with?
My good wife, Brenda.
How long have you lived with Brenda?
I've lived with Brenda for 49 years.
49 years. Wow. Now, Alfred, although this move is very, very good for you and your life's going to be immeasurably better, you won't be seeing Brenda ever again. How does that feel?
That will be the end of my life.
Oh. And Alfred, are there things that you do where you live? Well, I don't know if you're a man of faith. Do you worship?
Yes.
And is that with the community that you identify with?
Yes, it is with the community.
Yeah. And have you worshipped with those people for long?
Quite a long time, yes.
Well, another benefit for you is that you will no longer be able to worship in that place or with those people. How does that feel?
Another disaster.
Okay. Now, all of these significant changes are going to take place at exactly the same time. But I don't want you to worry about it. And I don't want your family to worry about it. Because, as I say, it's absolutely in your best interest. And if you think it's not in your best interest, we'll have a meeting. Your family can come along to that meeting and they can say whatever they like, but we will use the opportunity, quite rightly, to explain to you, again, in detail, why it's in your interest. Does that sound good?
Horrendous. Disastrous.
Don't be non-compliant. Sit down. I've been to countless best interest meetings over decades, and I can tell you there may have been some, but I cannot remember one There may have been one or two, but I cannot remember one where the outcome of that meeting was what the local authority wanted to do was not agreed and noted and filed for future reference. So what I would say to you, going back to the civilised and proportionate governance and regulation, we've heard from Luke and we've heard from Dr. Joyce that the current regulation, 1 is regulation, 2 is to ensure safety, 3 is to ensure and improve and guarantee quality and quality improvements. Well, I've got a slightly different take on that. In my view, as I say, based on over 30 years in the sector, what we have developed is what I would call a compliance industry. I think that what this compliance industry consists of is high levels of duplication, high levels of triplication, even levels of quadruplication at times. And I'll explain what I mean by that. If you're a residential provider, you will be monitored, regulated by, maybe quite rightly, by your host local authority. You will be monitored and regulated by the community local authorities that have made a placement with you, which may or may not be your host local authority. You will be monitored, governed, regulated by whatever is the latest iteration of the health authority for placements that the health authority make a partial or full contribution to. As we know, you'll be monitored or regulated by CQC. Providers themselves, who I've worked for over the years, will have their own compliance officers. Some of them, the larger compliance, will have more than one person. Some will have whole departments. Also in the sector are a number of contractors and interims, also consultancies, which all offer this service. In my experience, they really do boil down to lots and lots of jargon, which may or may not mean what it says on the tin, plus essentially tick box snapshot audit exercises on compliance. Do you comply with this? Do you comply with that? And as I say, it's multi-layered. This, of course, inevitably is hugely expensive. And what providers have to do, I don't blame providers for this. I work for providers. I've done it although I'm absolutely passionate about quality and people's lives and their families being involved in their lives, ultimately you have to comply, whatever that compliance is, even if some of that compliance strikes you as a bit odd, even if when you're dealing with multiple compliance agents, sometimes what one compliance agent and another compliance agent want you to do are contradictory. But nonetheless, as a provider, you have to work out a way of doing it. I'll give you, and also, as we've seen, we'd have to question the extent to which, at very least, some of that is evidence-based. I'm going to give you an example of an actual corridor conversation I had in an actual corridor with a compliance professional. So we were in a corridor and we were discussing the corridor. Fair enough. Now, the cohort we were talking about was a cohort that was profoundly multiply learning disabled, was what we would call had high health acuity. They had a high health acuity. They were very vulnerable people, young people, and they were exclusively confined to wheelchairs, quite big wheelchairs at times. It was necessary that they were belted into their wheelchairs, and there were some ways that you had to support them in certain positions. So the compliance officer, when we were looking at the corridor, said that they thought that the corridor should have handrails. I explained that handrails would be absolutely superfluous, that nobody who this facility was intended for would be able to get out of their wheelchair, and in fact, if in the event they were to attempt to do that independently, they would have had to, apart from having to have freed themselves from their safety belts, they would undoubtedly incur, bring quite risk and danger onto themselves. But where that ended up was the compliance officer telling me essentially that the handrails were the right thing to do. They were unable to tell me why, but they were the right thing to do. We continued in our discussion of the corridor, and the next point was that the corridor was too wide. And the corridor was too wide, and what would be better would be if it was replicated a domestic corridor. Now, one of the points I put was that the wheelchairs were quite big, and what we quite liked was that the wheelchairs could pass each other in opposite directions. Apart from that being good for people in their daily living, I also thought in critical situations such as fire that it would be quite useful to have, that level of room. That was not accepted, although the compliance officer accepted it would probably be a bit unreasonable to ask for those corridors to be redesigned. And towards the end of that discussion, it was disclosed to me that actually the absolute best environment would be a normal terraced house in a normal street. I nodded. But the reality is, none of the people in that cohort could have got through a normal door in a normal house in their wheelchair. Just could not enter it. So to me, that encapsulated the distance between what is purported to happen and what is really happening on the ground. Because let's be clear, providers are not illogical, they're not irrational. People who invest in this social care market will invest in this social care market, hopefully because, they want to do good, but unrealistic to expect people to invest in a social market where it's so precarious trying to provide a service. In a market where you have to raise decent funds to build suitable, fit-for-purpose buildings, and you're going to get someone and say, well, really, you should have bought a terraced house that no one could get into. One of my favourite quotes is by C.S. Lewis, and he says, "Of all the tyrannies, a tyranny exercised for the good of its victims may be the most oppressive." Now, a choice-based model, I just want to say, I have understood for many years now what's happening in terms of what the management books call a stakeholder analysis. Now, I will tell you my absolute view of the stakeholder analysis of the social market that is social care is the boss stakeholders are absolutely state professionals. These are not independent views. They're professional trade unions or professional associations, same difference. These are very powerful stakeholders. Very large corporations are powerful stakeholders. And also private equity firms are enormously powerful. Now, I'm not against any of those stakeholders. I'm not against private equity. I think it's got I may be a minority view, but I think it's got a huge role to play in the transformation of this sector. But I would want it to be rewarded for creativity, innovation and outcomes rather than delivering on a what I see as an increasingly homogeneous offer from the sector. What is the low influence, almost no influence stakeholders are families, our service users, and our communities. It doesn't matter what the jargon is telling us. That is the reality on the ground, and that's something I've seen over many years. When I've worked in local authorities, continually I've seen the language of dissent and stigmatisation used towards families. Families who want, don't get me wrong, I've worked with the odd family who really are very unreasonable. But by and large, wanting a good life for your loved one is not an unreasonable aspiration. Most of us have it. I have it about my own children, and obviously I go the extra mile to try and make sure that happens. But internally, in local authorities and in statutory authorities, my experience has been, and obviously I've challenged this at times, my experience has been that kind of the language of they're unreasonable, they're non-compliant, they're unrealistic. These sorts of things creep into what should be objective professional assessments of eligibility and funding eligibility. What I would say, that increasing homogeneity of supply, as opposed to diversity, long income streams, high barriers to entry around capital investment and regulation, all leads to a furtherance of these effects on those stakeholders. And if you want to see what happens further down that journey for working age people with learning disabilities, look at children's services, where increasingly private equity invests in certain types of provision. Children's residential is now incredibly expensive. So once that market, social market, is captured, then of course the leverage is even more so with private equity. Now, I don't know this, but I've been told that in older people, I might be wrong, but I've been told that four key providers, regardless of the brands on the front door, tend to provide into that market now. And so inevitably, more and more homogeneous, oddly, given our discussion here, bigger and bigger residential homes are getting built, and that is attracting more and more of a certain type of finance. Offers that are designed by families, by communities, by service users themselves, by altruistic individuals, will be gradually squeezed out more and more and more. And make no mistake about it, we are on a journey where there will be no more villages. If people do not speak up now, there will be no more. There are none being registered. Local authorities increasingly are not making placements in them. A freedom of information request we sent out, 30% came back, and the local authorities concerned said they would not make a placement regardless if the professional assessment was that that was the best way to meet that need. Look, I'm going to leave it there. Honestly, there's loads more, but thank you for indulging me.